gospel for this day continues in the 7th chapter of Mark, today verses 24 through 37. Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice, but a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee, to the region of Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be open." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The gospel of our Lord. There is this story which may be familiar to some of you about an old dog that fell down its master's well. After assessing the situation, the owner decided the best course of action for rescuing the dog was to shovel dirt into the well. As he began the rescue process, the dog became hysterical and would howl back. But as each shovel load of dirt hit the dog's back, the dog would shake it off and slowly step up. This of course went on for hours. Finally, the exhausted and dirty dog stepped up and over the well wall. To the dog, the dirt was an adversary, but actually it was its deliverance. More importantly, it was a joint effort involving the owner's persistence and the willingness of the dog to cooperate that made for a happy ending. After a few weeks of research into this text from the 7th chapter of Mark's Gospel, I decided to develop my first portion of this message relative to verses 24 through 30 to you today from my perspective of how this encounter between Jesus and the Syro-Phoenician woman is like the dog in the well story which I just conveyed to you. You may have noticed last week that after 5 weeks of texts from the Gospel of John, the readings have returned to the Gospel of Mark. And that's from where our readings will emanate until Christ the King Sunday, which is prior to the season of Advent. Beginning with the feeding of the 5,000 back in Mark chapter 6, the Revised Common Lectionary has provided us with texts which include a series of miracles. Along the way, Jesus has been dealing with the antagonism of the scribes and Pharisees, several of whom have been following Jesus from Jerusalem on his journey to Galilee, something we discovered in the gospel reading from last Sunday. Additionally, Jesus has become frustrated on occasions with his disciples who have not yet fully grasped and understood his mission and ministry, not for what he is endeavoring to teach them in preparation for his future departure from their presence. It's not really made clear by Mark, knowing the parallel version of the story found in Matthew chapter 15, verses 21 through 28, exactly why Jesus decided to make this long journey into the region of Tyre and Sidon, a lengthy trip of about 35 miles northwest of Galilee. For this is Gentile country. Perhaps Jesus felt that he needed the rest and to get away from the harassment from the Jewish leaders. Perhaps in this predominantly Gentile coastal area near the Mediterranean Sea, moving from the region of the Herodians who had sought to kill Jesus to a place where presumably he would be relatively unknown to the political leaders and general population who were primarily of Greek heritage. Jesus, he hoped, could remain unnoticed. He was aware that no respectable Jew would venture into this unclean territory inhabited by people whom the Jews considered to be dogs. For all intents and purposes, during this era of history, you might say that the Jews wanted the Gentiles to stay trapped in a well. But as soon as he discovers this, Jesus was not unknown in this region. Despite efforts to conceal his whereabouts, he could not escape notice, as we find in verse 24. Even in this pagan territory, Jesus' reputation preceded him. Yet somehow a gentle woman of Syro-Phoenician, that's Greek origin, immediately, one of Mark's favorite words, appears out of nowhere. I think at this point Mark is making a subtle contrast of how tentative and resentful the Jewish leaders, after years of manifesting their contempt, continue to reject Jesus, while this idolatrous, pagan, Gentile dog of a woman welcomes and honors this Jewish man whom she has never before seen, by immediately bowing down in his presence. The Jews have constantly made demands that Jesus desist from revealing his miraculous power, while this desperate mother begs him to heal her daughter because he alone has the divine gift to do so. By all accounts, she is an unworthy outcast who has come to Jesus, begging for mercy on behalf of her ill daughter. Even when it appears that Jesus insults her and will obviously turn her away, she doesn't get offended by being called a dog. She doesn't chastise, attack, or impugn Jesus' character. Instead, she acknowledges that she is completely undeserving of anything good which Jesus could give, and that the blessings of God's table are intended to overflow, and the dogs will eventually get the leftovers. She truly understands that her place is not at the table of God's blessings with God's children. I'm sure you're fully aware by now that the dialogue between Jesus and the Gentile woman is rife with metaphorical imagery, with Jesus employing a mini parable to make his point. What's amazing in the story is that the woman, unlike the 12 disciples to whom Jesus has been teaching for more than 2 years now, she understands the parable without it being explained to her. Not only does she understand the point that Jesus is making, through her responses to Jesus, she acknowledges her position by agreeing with Jesus that indeed she is unworthy and she is undeserving. She knows she doesn't deserve the help for which she is asking. She doesn't plead her case because she doesn't have anything to offer in her defense, bringing only her need for Jesus' goodness. That's how she approached Jesus, and that's how we are to approach him in our times of need. We are to come to Jesus, not claiming our own strength, our intellect, our heritage, our understanding, or especially our worthiness. This woman came to Jesus simply believing that he was powerful and good, and that he was able to heal. And so he does. The woman receives mercy. Her daughter is healed, so she went home and found her daughter lying on the bed, free from the demon that had possessed her. The Syrophoenician woman had what I call a feisty faith and a dogged determination, much like the dog who had fallen in the well and was resolute on getting out. In this story, I think the lesson to be learned is that when we are faced with obstacles and insurmountable difficulties, we must go to the Lord with our eyes and hearts on him, trusting that he will work for good to rectify our situation by piling up loads of grace and mercy to help us climb out of a well deep with the sins that we have committed. Perhaps too often we seek his help by being submissive in our faithfulness when Jesus expects us to be persistent and aggressive like this woman and mother who challenged Jesus in her boldness. To quote Martin Luther, "Be a sinner and sin boldly, but believe and rejoice in Christ even more boldly." Now, in verse 31 of our text, the scene shifts as Jesus leaves Tyre and travels to the region of the Decapolis, which is another predominantly Gentile-populated area just north of Galilee. The cities in this territory were established centuries ago by the Greeks, and the Jews in Galilee resented the Gentile presence on their northern border. However, the Romans who controlled the territory when Jesus lived encouraged the growth of Greek culture there as a way of limiting Jewish influence. For reasons not given in this text, Jesus has decided to remain in the Gentile territory rather than return to the more familiar area around the Sea of Galilee and his home in Capernaum. The final 7 verses from our gospel text today describe another situation where Jesus has an opportunity to heal a man who, according to the text, is deaf and has a speech impediment. Employing his usual literary style of not going into much detail when conveying his information, Mark ambiguously uses the pronoun they, if you notice, twice in verse 32. So Mark is emphasizing the importance of this miracle soon to be performed by Jesus instead of the persons that are involved. As in the previous healing story, no names are mentioned other than Jesus. And since a crowd has assembled, we can again assume that Jesus' reputation precedes his appearance. This man brought to Jesus by people who begged for Jesus to lay hands on him. Well, it's important for us to understand the connection that Mark makes in these two stories in light of the audience to which Mark is addressing when he wrote this gospel, and that being to the Gentile Christians approximately 35 years after Jesus' death. In both cases, the individuals being healed, that's the woman's daughter, and this deaf mute, do not directly come to Jesus, but advocate beggars plead to Jesus for help. Also, after the afflicted man's ears were opened and his tongue released, Jesus ordered people who witnessed this miracle to not tell anyone. By healing this man, Jesus' popularity presumably has reached a new high. But Jesus was definitely aware that it was not yet time to fully extend his ministry to the Gentiles. By healing the deaf man and the woman's daughter, Jesus, who had crossed all sorts of geographical, racial, and religious boundaries during his ministries, shows his commitment is not only to be the Messiah to the Jews, the children of God, but also to those who are different, regardless of condition or culture. In Jesus' time, any sickness or infirmity which occurred was considered to be a result of sin, especially within the Jewish community. Also, little or no medical treatments were available for healing conditions such as paralysis, blindness, deafness, or the inability to speak. People could often only hope for a miracle. The name Jesus brought such hope to many who were labeled as outcasts through no fault of their own. Today, those persons who are considered marginalized not only have Jesus in whom they can find respite and relief, they also have us. For example, in my grandmother Leona Quinn Gustafson's families over the generations, there were several people who were born deaf. She had a couple of aunts, some cousins, a brother and sister, and a niece and nephew who were born deaf. I can recall early in my childhood the conditions in which those members of my extended family had to live, which were quite difficult for individuals and families alike. Most every time I drive out this direction to New Sweden and beyond, I recall the experiences I had of coming out with my parents and sisters to visit my great-uncle Frank Quinn and his wife Meta, and their children Linda and Michael, both of whom were born deaf. They lived not far from here, piece down the road. You go down where you make the first curve, just west of our location here. Their family dynamic was very difficult. As you can imagine, it was for a lot of people that were marginalized back in the 50s and the 60s. They were an extremely poor family whose parents could speak. Uncle Frank and Meta, they could speak and they could hear, but they were raising children who could do neither. But thanks to loving and caring neighbors like Edwin and Anna Magnuson and their daughter Sharon, now Robbins, opportunities for joy and friendship brought hope and a semblance of healing into this struggling family. Sharon, can't thank you enough for all your kindness. When people would come or were brought to Jesus to be healed, much was at stake. Healing gave people an opportunity to become a member of society once more, or maybe for the first time in some instances. Healing, whether it occurred 2,000 years ago or today, brings restoration of life. No wonder people came in droves from everywhere to Jesus for healing. They were hungry for life, and Jesus, in his compassion, gave the gift of life to all who were in need. Now, we don't know exactly what happened to any of the people who were part of our gospel reading today, except for one. In our worship today and every week, we are presented with good news, which at times doesn't really seem to be that good. Struggles are a significant part of the Christian life. Many Christians have difficulty grasping the connection between the sovereignty of God and our struggles and hardships. Very often, adversities show us where we have weak areas in our faith. They test our commitment and measure our level of perseverance. They allow us to glorify God in ways beyond all human understanding. So with whom do you identify in our gospel from Mark today? The Syro-Phoenician mother or her daughter? The deaf man with his speech impediment? Or one of the they who brought the deaf man to Jesus? I think it's important to realize that to God, we are to represent each of these people whom we came to know a little bit more about today, and perhaps even about ourselves. So in closing, I invite you to think of those times in your life when you were figuratively stuck in a well, wondering how you got there, and more importantly, how am I going to get out? More times than not, our rescue will involve someone else and something unexpected. God sometimes uses other people to provide for our deliverance and relief, but Jesus will always be there to help if you let him. Thanks be to God. Amen. We continue our worship with our sermon hymn, hymn number 87 in your blue familiar book, Lord of the Dance. Please stand as you are able.